You think medieval people were dirty, stupid, and died at 30. You're wrong about all three, and the actual statistics are so bizarre they'll make you question everything your history teacher told you. One number in particular, it shouldn't even be possible. Here's the thing about that people died at 30 myth. It's technically true and completely misleading. The average life expectancy hovered around 30 to 35 years. Sounds brutal, right? But that number is lying to you. Infant mortality absolutely destroyed the statistics. About 30% of children died before their 5th birthday. Diseases we now prevent with a quick jab at the doctor's office, those wiped out entire nurseries. But here's what nobody tells you. If you actually made it to 21, you could expect another 25 to 30 years. People regularly hit 50, 60, even 70. My grandmother would have fit right in, and wealth didn't help much either. Edward the Black Prince, one of England's greatest warriors, died at 45. Kings fell to fevers, not enemy swords. Women faced the worst odds. Roughly 1 in 3 died from pregnancy-related complications during their lifetime. 1 in 3. So medieval people weren't dying young from old age. They were dying young from being young. But what about the ones who survived? Their work schedule might actually make you jealous. Medieval farmers actually had more days off than you do right now. I'm not joking. Your average peasant worked around 150 days per year. Meanwhile, most Americans clock in for 250 plus. Let that sink in for a second. The Catholic Church basically invented the long weekend. Sundays off, obviously, but then add dozens of saints' days, harvest festivals, and entire Holy Weeks scattered throughout the calendar. Winter? Almost no field work at all. Peasants spent those dark months repairing tools, weaving, and honestly, just hanging out with neighbors. Now here's the catch. During harvest season, things got brutal. We're talking 16-hour days from dawn until you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. No breaks. Your back screaming every day for weeks. But outside harvest, 8-hour workdays with a long lunch break in the middle. My boss would never approve that schedule. These people actually ate dinner with their families every night. But feeding those families, that's where things got terrifying. 90% of people farmed. That's not a typo. 9 out of every 10 human beings spent their entire existence growing food, from the moment they could walk until the day they dropped dead. And here's what makes it worse. A peasant family needed about 30 acres to survive comfortably. Most held 12 to 15. That gap? That's the difference between eating and watching your children starve. Modern farms pull 50 bushels of wheat from a single acre. Medieval farmers, 8 to 10. Maybe on a good year with perfect weather and a lot of prayer. But even when the harvest came in decent, peasants only kept half. The Lord took his cut, the church took its tithe. You saved seed for next year. What remained was yours. Crop rotation wasn't really a thing until the 11th century either. Earlier generations just watched their soil turn to dust, exhausted, useless. A bad harvest didn't mean tight budgets, it meant bodies in the street. Between 1315 and 1317, Europe got a taste of what hell actually looks like. It rained and kept raining for 2 straight years. Crops rotted in fields that turned into swamps. Livestock drowned standing up. The Great Famine had arrived. Food prices didn't just rise, they exploded. Some regions saw bread cost 800% more than normal. A single loaf suddenly equaled a week's wages. Parents faced choices no human should ever make. Chroniclers across multiple countries documented the same horrifying pattern. Abandoned children, cannibalism, things people couldn't speak of afterward. England's population dropped from 5 million to 4 million in just 24 months. That's 1 million dead. Gone. And the animals? England lost 62% of its oxen. The very beasts needed to plow fields for recovery. Here's what really stings, though. This catastrophe weakened an entire generation. Their immune systems, their bodies, their ability to fight disease. 30 years later, something far worse came knocking. The Black Death didn't knock. It kicked the door down. Between 1347 and 1351, somewhere between 75 and 200 million people died. That's not a typo. 200 million. Some villages completely erased. Archaeologists have found entire settlements just abandoned overnight. Everyone either dead or fled. Venice counted 600 corpses daily. One city, 600 bodies, every single day. And doctors? They had solutions. Brilliant ones like smelling flowers and sitting between two fires. Because obviously bad air caused everything. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. But here's where things get interesting. Labor suddenly became precious. With half the workforce gone, peasants could actually negotiate. Wages doubled, sometimes tripled. For the first time in history, surviving at the bottom meant having options. Europe's population didn't bounce back until the 1500s. That's 150 years of demographic recovery. Death reshaped everything: economics, society, even how people bathed. Here's the thing. Medieval people weren't the unwashed barbarians movies loved to show. London alone had 18 licensed bathhouses in the 1300s. 18. That's more than some neighborhoods have coffee shops today. And soap? England was actually exporting the stuff to other countries by the 1200s. Not importing. Exporting. They had a soap industry. Monks had rules requiring regular bathing. The church literally mandated cleanliness. Wash your hands before meals, bathe on schedule, keep yourself presentable before God. Bathhouses cost about a penny to enter, roughly an hour's wage for a skilled worker. Pretty reasonable, honestly. Nobles took it further. Wooden tubs lined with cloth. Servants hauling hot water up stone staircases. Sometimes the whole family shared, highest rank to lowest. So what happened? The plague happened. Suddenly people believed water opened your pores to disease. Bathing became dangerous. Cleanliness actually declined in later centuries. The medieval folks were cleaner than their Renaissance grandchildren. Speaking of surprising customs, marriage worked differently too. Noble girls could legally marry at 12, boys at 14. Sounds horrifying by modern standards, and honestly, it kind of was, but here's what movies get wrong. These were political arrangements, not love stories. Signing a treaty, basically, with a person attached. But wait, peasant women actually married later. Average age, 18 to 22. Families needed their daughters working the fields, not raising babies in someone else's household. About 20% of medieval women never married at all. Some joined convents. Others worked as servants until they died. Single forever, centuries before it was cool. And love? Considered foolish. Dangerous even. Marrying for attraction was like buying a house because you liked the paint color. Families wanted land, alliances, connections. A bride's dowry could bankrupt her parents. 2 to 3 years of total household income. Gone. For one daughter, divorce? Forget it. Essentially impossible, though annulments existed. If you had money and connections and a creative priest. Speaking of family planning, medieval mothers faced absolutely brutal odds. A typical married woman got pregnant 6 to 8 times, but only half those children lived to adulthood. Let that sink in. Childbirth killed more women than war killed men. Roughly 1 to 2% of mothers died with each delivery. Sounds small, but multiply that across 8 pregnancies. The math gets terrifying fast. And here's the thing. Doctors weren't even allowed in the birthing room. Male physicians? Banned. Midwives handled everything, for better or worse. Wealthy mothers had an interesting workaround. They hired wet nurses, outsourced the breastfeeding entirely, which meant noble women became pregnant again almost immediately, sometimes within months of giving birth. Peasant mothers did the opposite. Breastfeeding for 2 to 3 years. Natural birth control, basically. Fewer pregnancies. Better survival rates for existing children. Those massive medieval families with 12 kids? Church records show they were rare exceptions. Not the norm at all. Families spent half their lives watching children die. Speaking of coping mechanisms, sleep worked very differently back then. Forget everything you know about sleeping through the night. Medieval Europeans didn't. They went to bed when the sun went down, woke up around midnight, stayed awake for an hour or two, then slept again until dawn. 2 sleeps. Every single night. And here's the weird part, they didn't consider this strange. Medical texts actually recommended it. Doctors said the midnight wakeful period was perfect for making babies. I'm not joking. What did people do during those quiet hours? Prayed, talked with their spouse, visited neighbors, sometimes just stared at the ceiling contemplating life's mysteries. Now, picture the sleeping arrangements. Entire families crammed into one room. Parents, kids, grandparents, servants. Sometimes everyone shared the same bed. Privacy? Never heard of her. Peasants slept on mattresses stuffed with hay, hence hitting the hay. The wealthy got feathers. Revolutionary comfort for the time. Modern researchers tested this, put people in rooms without electric lights. Within weeks, they naturally started sleeping twice. Speaking of things we take for granted, most people couldn't even read the word sleep. Here's the thing about medieval Europe. Only 5 to 10% of people could read. That's it. Everyone else? Completely illiterate. And honestly, why bother learning? Books cost as much as houses. I'm not exaggerating. A single Bible required 250 sheep worth of parchment. Then, a monk had to copy it by hand for years. England owned maybe 1,000 books total in 1100 AD. The whole country. Your local library has more. But here's what surprises people. Even nobles couldn't read. These were wealthy, powerful men who signed treaties and ruled kingdoms. They had clerks for that. Reading was considered a professional skill, like plumbing. So how did illiterate people remember anything important? They memorized everything. Hundreds of prayers, epic poems, legal agreements, songs passed down for generations. Their brains worked differently than ours. Legal documents didn't require signatures either. Couldn't write your name? No problem. Wax seals and witnesses handled it. Speaking of expensive things most people couldn't afford, let's talk about knights. Becoming a knight cost about as much as buying a Ferrari today. I'm serious. Full armor, weapons, multiple war horses. We're talking 40 to 50 pounds in medieval money. That's 10 to 15 years of wages for a skilled worker, gone, on one guy's equipment. And the horses, a single war horse ran 20 to 80 pounds. Knights needed 3 or 4 of them. One for battle, one for travel, one for carrying all their stuff. Another as backup. That's not even counting maintenance. Keeping a knight operational cost roughly 100 pounds per year. Horses eat. Armor rusts. Squires need payment. Weapons break. So who could actually afford this? About 1% of the population. Medieval England had maybe 6,000 or 7,000 knights total. That's it. Here's the funny part. Many knights were basically broke. They owned impressive gear, but couldn't afford dinner. All flash, no cash. You'd think these expensive warriors dominated every battlefield, but the weapon that actually won most medieval wars? It cost pennies. Here's the twist nobody talks about. Swords, the weapon everyone associates with medieval warfare? Only 5 to 10% of soldiers actually carried one. That's it. The sword was basically the Rolex of the battlefield. Impressive to look at, expensive to own, but not exactly practical for the average guy. A quality sword cost 6 to 12 months of a skilled craftsman's wages. Your typical peasant conscript couldn't afford a decent pair of boots, let alone a weapon that costs more than his house. So what did everyone else carry? Spears, pikes, polearms, basically sharp things on long sticks. Why? They were cheap, effective, and you could train someone to use one in about a week. Plus, here's the thing. Swords work terribly against plate armor. You're basically whacking metal with metal. Maces and hammers, those crushed armor. Much better investment. But the real game changer cost almost nothing at all. And it terrified knights more than anything else on the battlefield. The longbow. A weapon so devastating that French knights had nightmares about it. And here's why. A trained English archer could fire 10 to 12 arrows per minute. Crossbowmen? Maybe 2 or 3. Do the math on that. But that firing rate came at a cost. Drawing a longbow required 100 to 185 pounds of force, every single shot. Your morning workout has nothing on these guys. Archaeologists can actually identify medieval archers by their skeletons. Their left arms grew visibly longer than their right, spines curved, shoulders warped. These men became physically deformed from years of training, and that training started young. Age 7, sometimes earlier, English law literally required every man to practice archery after church on Sundays. Skip practice, that's a fine. At Agincourt, 5,000 archers fired roughly 60,000 arrows per minute. Picture that. Metal rain falling from the sky. But even the deadliest weapons couldn't help you survive what happened after the battle ended. Most castles didn't fall in some dramatic final assault. They surrendered because everyone inside was starving. The average siege lasted about 6 weeks. 6 weeks of sitting outside walls, waiting for the food to run out. Exciting, right? But here's what made sieges truly miserable. Disease killed more attackers than defenders ever did. Armies camping in their own filth lost 10 to 30% of men to dysentery and fever. You came to conquer a castle and got taken out by bad sanitation instead. Building siege equipment took forever too. A single trebuchet required weeks of construction and engineers who actually knew what they were doing. Those guys were expensive. Some castles held out for months. Chateau Gaillard resisted for 6 full months before finally falling in 1204. The smart play? Dig tunnels under the walls. Undermine the foundations. Watch entire towers collapse into rubble. And if you did storm the wall successfully, what happened next made the siege look like a friendly disagreement. Here's the thing about medieval battles. They weren't these all-day affairs Hollywood shows you. Most fights wrapped up in 30 minutes to 2 hours. That's it. Wearing 60 pounds of armor while swinging weapons? You'd be gassed after 10 minutes. I get winded walking upstairs sometimes. The winning side usually lost under 10% of their men. The losers, 50% or more got cut down. The battle itself wasn't what killed most soldiers, though. Running away was. Once one side broke and fled, cavalry hunted them like wolves chasing deer. You can't outrun a horse in armor. At Agincourt, over 6,000 French soldiers died in roughly 3 hours, most during the panicked retreat. And here's something brutal. Knights carried special hammers not for fighting, but for finishing off exhausted opponents lying in the mud. Heat exhaustion in armor killed plenty of men before any enemy reached them. They basically suffocated inside their own equipment, but at least battles had rules. What passed for justice back then? Absolutely unhinged. Trial by combat wasn't some movie invention. Courts actually used it. Got a dispute with your neighbor? A judge might literally order you two to fight. The belief was simple. God wouldn't let an innocent person lose. So whoever won was automatically right. Pretty convenient legal system, honestly. But here's where it gets interesting. Women, old men, and priests didn't have to fight themselves. They could hire professional champions. Basically, medieval lawyers who solved cases with swords instead of paperwork. And get this, the last official trial by combat in England? 1818. Not 1418. 1818. Some guy actually invoked this ancient right, and the court had no legal grounds to refuse him. If you lost the fight, you didn't just lose your case. Execution or prison waited for you regardless. The church preferred a different approach, though. They liked trial by ordeal. Grab a red-hot iron bar. If your burns healed cleanly, you're innocent. Sounds barbaric, but here's the twist. Most people pass these ordeals. Priests probably rigged those ordeals. Historians think the heating process was manipulated. Church officials wanted specific outcomes. But actual crime punishment, that was a whole different beast. Hanging was the go-to execution for common criminals. Quick, cheap, and the crowd got a show. But nobles, they received beheading. Apparently getting your head chopped off was a privilege. Thanks, I guess. Traitors got the deluxe package. Hanging, drawing, and quartering. They'd partially strangle you, cut you open while still alive, then chop you into 4 pieces. Your body parts got displayed around the city as a warning. For smaller crimes, branding was popular. Hot iron pressed into your thumb or face, permanent mark. Everyone would know what you did for the rest of your life. Stocks and pillories held people in public squares. Crowds threw rotten vegetables, sometimes mud, occasionally stones. Here's the strange part, though. Many theft cases just resulted in fines. Steal a chicken, pay money, and go home. Medieval medicine was even stranger than their justice system. Medieval doctors were basically guessing. Educated guessing, sure, but still guessing. Their entire medical system rested on 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Feeling angry? Too much yellow bile? Depressed? Black bile was the culprit. Every single illness came down to these 4 fluids being out of balance. The cure? Bloodletting. For almost everything. Headache? Drain some blood. Fever? More bloodletting. Infection? You guessed it. Doctors genuinely believed removing excess blood fixed whatever ailed you. Spoiler alert, it usually made things worse. Here's where it gets wild. Physicians diagnosed illness by examining urine. Color, smell, and yes, taste, they actually tasted it. That was considered cutting-edge medicine. Real surgery? Barbers handled that. The red and white barber pole you see today represents blood and bandages. Your haircut guy was also your surgeon. For pain relief, patients got alcohol, opium, or mandrake root. Many died from the anesthesia, not the actual procedure, but wounded soldiers had it even worse. Battlefield wounds? A death sentence with a countdown timer. Average survival for a seriously wounded soldier was about 2 days. That's it. No antibiotics existed, so infection spread faster than rumors in a small village. Arrow stuck in you. The treatment involved pushing it completely through your body, then yanking it out the exit wound. I'll give you a moment with that image. Surgeons carried special spoon-shaped tools designed specifically for digging arrowheads out of flesh. Medieval Amazon must have had a whole section for those. The real nightmare? Cauterization. Doctors sealed wounds using red-hot iron or boiling oil pressed directly against open flesh. Many patients died from shock before infection even got a chance. Crusader medical records paint a grim picture. Only 1 in 10 soldiers with gut wounds survived past a week. But here's the weird twist. Skull fractures actually had decent outcomes. Drilling holes in heads, called trephination, saved more lives than you'd expect. Speaking of survival, let's talk about what people were drinking. Here's a fun fact. Medieval people probably drank more than your college roommate. Small beer was the universal beverage, about 2 to 3% alcohol, just enough to kill bacteria without getting anyone stumbling drunk. Well, not from 1 cup anyway. Daily consumption? 1 to 2 gallons per person, including children. Before you call medieval parents irresponsible, consider this. Water was genuinely trying to kill people. Rivers doubled as sewers. Wells sat next to cesspits. Drinking water meant gambling with dysentery. Monasteries ran the biggest breweries. Some pumped out over 100,000 gallons annually. Monks were basically running medieval Anheuser-Busch. And here's something interesting. Women dominated brewing for centuries. Alewives controlled the industry until male guilds decided that looked too profitable and pushed them out. Wine regions drank wine instead. But Northern Europe couldn't grow grapes, so beer became the answer to everything. Speaking of valuable things people couldn't live without, salt had everyone fighting wars. Roman soldiers weren't just paid in gold, they got salt too. The word salary literally comes from salarium, salt money. Your paycheck exists because ancient soldiers needed seasoning. But here's where it gets interesting. Medieval salt could cost 10 times its weight in wheat. Not gold, but close enough that poor families treated it like we treat saffron today. A tiny pinch, carefully measured. And preserving meat? That required absurd amounts. A single pig needed over 20 pounds of salt to cure properly. Suddenly, that expense makes sense. Salt mines became strategic assets. The Salzburg region? That name means salt fortress. Wars were fought over these deposits. Actual wars, with actual casualties. Over a mineral we dump on French fries without thinking. Venice built an entire trading empire monopolizing Mediterranean salt routes. They weren't shipping gold or silk, just crystallized seawater. Church-mandated fish days created enormous demand for salted herring. Entire coastal economies survived on this. Speaking of expensive things the church inadvertently made essential, spices were about to get ridiculous. Pepper. A spice so valuable that 1 pound cost the same as an entire pig. For a common laborer, that's a full month's wages, just for seasoning. But pepper was practically cheap compared to nutmeg. A small bag of those little brown nuts could literally buy you a house. Not a nice house. A house. With walls and everything. Why so expensive? These spices grew only in distant islands most Europeans couldn't find on a map. Traders passed goods through dozens of hands, each one adding markup. By the time cinnamon reached London, it had traveled 8,000 miles and increased in price about 4,000%. Wealthy families didn't just lock away their jewelry, they locked away their spice cabinets. Only the lord or lady held the key. Servants stealing pepper faced the same punishment as stealing silver. And counterfeit spices? Real problem. Dealers caught mixing nutmeg with sawdust or passing off random berries as peppercorns faced brutal punishment. This obsession with seasoning would eventually reshape the entire world. Because guess who controlled most of Europe's money? The church wasn't just a spiritual institution, it was medieval Europe's largest landlord. Religious institutions owned roughly a third of all farmable land across the continent. 1 in 3 acres, controlled by bishops, monasteries, and the Pope himself. And here's where it gets interesting. Everyone paid a tithe. 10% of everything you earned went straight to the church. Not optional, not voluntary. Miss a payment and you risked your immortal soul. At least that's what they told you. Monasteries operated like medieval corporations. They ran farms, breweries, hospitals, and schools. Some abbeys were richer than the noble families living next door. The Pope? Often wealthier than kings. Money flowed into Rome from every Catholic country in Europe. Every single one. Bishops commanded armies. Abbots advised monarchs. Church courts operated completely separate from royal justice. Kill a priest, you'd face church punishment, not the king's executioner. This created an interesting problem, because all that religious wealth had to be displayed somewhere, usually in buildings. Medieval cities smelled like death, and I'm not being dramatic. Most streets doubled as open sewers. No drains, no garbage collection, just everything piling up where it landed. People tossed chamber pots straight out windows. The polite ones shouted "Gardez-vous" first, a warning that roughly translated to "watch out for the water." Spoiler, it wasn't water. Butchers slaughtered animals right in the street. Blood, guts, bones, left to rot in the summer heat. Delightful. The Thames in London, basically a flowing toilet. And people still drank from it. Makes you appreciate modern plumbing, doesn't it? Rats loved these conditions. Absolutely thrived. Which explains why plague spread like wildfire through urban centers. Paris reportedly smelled so bad that visitors vomited upon entering. The king himself complained about the stench rising to his palace windows. And here's the thing, nobody cleaned up until people started dying in massive numbers. Only then did authorities consider maybe, just maybe, hygiene mattered. But fire. Fire was the real city killer. Fire didn't care how rich you were. Medieval cities were basically giant tinderboxes waiting for a spark. Wooden buildings crammed together. Thatched roofs everywhere. Open flames in every single room for cooking and light. One knocked over candle, entire neighborhoods gone by morning. London burned down so many times before 1666 that people basically expected it. Paris, Rouen, Hamburg, the list goes on. And firefighting, hilarious by modern standards. Bucket brigades, tiny hand pumps that barely dribbled water. Sometimes they just demolished buildings in the fire's path, hoping to create a gap. Spoiler, it rarely worked. Strong winds could carry embers across entire streets. Once flames jumped, nothing stopped them. Eventually, some cities got smart. They required stone construction in central areas, banned thatched roofs, created wider streets as fire breaks, but these changes came slowly, after thousands had already lost everything. Here's what's interesting, though. Fire wasn't the only disaster people faced regularly. Education itself was practically a luxury. Think you could just walk into a classroom and learn? Not a chance. Universities existed, sure, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, but these were basically exclusive clubs for the ultra-wealthy and those destined for church careers. Here's the catch. Every single class was taught in Latin. If you didn't know Latin, you couldn't even understand what the professor was saying. And who learned Latin? Rich kids with private tutors. Students started shockingly young. 14-year-olds debating theology and law. Meanwhile, most people their age were already working full-time jobs. The discipline was brutal too. Students got beaten for talking back, fined for missing prayers, expelled for looking at a professor wrong. Makes modern detention seem like a vacation. But here's what's interesting. The vast majority of people learned skills the practical way. Apprenticeships. You wanted to be a blacksmith? You worked for one for 7 years. No textbooks, no tests, just hammer and metal. Education was for the elite. Entertainment, though, that was for everyone. And it was absolutely savage. Entertainment wasn't just rough, it was downright savage. Public executions, those were the blockbuster events of the medieval world. Families packed picnics, vendors sold snacks, people showed up hours early for good spots. Watching someone get hanged was basically their version of going to the movies. But wait, it gets worse. Bear baiting drew massive crowds. The setup was simple. Chain a bear to a post, release a pack of dogs, and watch them fight to the death. Gambling on the outcome? Absolutely encouraged. Jousting looked glamorous in the movies, but knights actually died. Lances shattered. Horses trampled riders. One tournament in Germany killed over 60 participants in a single day. Even casual entertainment had an edge. Dice games caused brawls. Festivals turned into drunken chaos lasting days. And jesters? They told jokes so crude I can't repeat them here. Makes modern entertainment seem almost boring, right? But here's something unexpected. What people wore revealed everything about them. Clothing wasn't just fashion. It was your ID card. The medieval world had actual laws telling you what you could wear, called sumptuary laws. And breaking them? That meant fines, public humiliation, or having your clothes confiscated right off your back. Purple was reserved for royalty. Silk? Only nobles. Certain furs, specific fabrics, even particular buttons belonged exclusively to the upper classes. Here's the kicker. A wealthy merchant could afford the finest velvet in Europe, but wearing it? Illegal. His money couldn't buy permission. These laws existed because clothing was absurdly expensive. One decent outfit cost several months of wages. People owned maybe 2 or 3 garments total, wore them daily until they literally fell apart. And forget those drab brown peasant costumes from movies. Common folk actually wore bright colors when they could afford them. Blue from woad, red from madder, yellow from weld. Clothing told everyone exactly who you were before you spoke a single word. But getting anywhere to show off those clothes, that was a whole different nightmare. Most medieval peasants never traveled more than 20 miles from their birthplace. Their entire world fit inside a radius smaller than your morning commute. And honestly, that was the smart move. Roads were nightmares, not potholes. We're talking knee-deep mud that swallowed carts whole during rain. Dust clouds thick enough to choke you in summer. No signs, no maps for common folk. Then there were the bandits. Outlaws lurked in forests waiting for anyone stupid enough to travel alone. Merchants hired armed guards. Regular people, they just stayed home. But let's say you risked it anyway. Finding shelter meant staying at inns where you'd share a bed with complete strangers. Sometimes 3 or 4 people crammed together. Hope nobody snored. A 100-mile journey took a week minimum. That's like walking from London to Oxford taking longer than flying to Australia does today. Pilgrimages were the main exception. People traveled to holy sites seeking miracles or forgiveness for sins. But speaking of time, how did anyone actually know what hour it was? Mechanical clocks? Those weren't common until the 1300s. Before that, people had no idea what 3:15 meant. Most folks tracked time by the sun. Noon was when shadows pointed north. Simple as that. Church bells did the heavy lifting. They rang for morning prayers, midday meals, evening vespers. Your entire schedule depended on some monk yanking a rope. Here's the weird part. Hours weren't fixed lengths. Daylight got divided into 12 equal parts regardless of season. Summer hours stretched longer. Winter hours shrank. A third hour in July lasted way longer than one in December. Nobody cared about minutes. The concept barely existed for regular people. You showed up around midday or after the bells. Close enough. And honestly, that sounds kind of peaceful. No rushing to meetings. No checking your phone every 30 seconds. Life moved with the sun, the seasons, the natural rhythm of the world. Maybe medieval people had less time, but they definitely wasted less of it watching it tick away.